Political Project, The Minimum Wage by James Buchholz. Today, I'll be going over popular and common topics related to the federal minimum wage. This will include an overview of the minimum wage, the reason behind it, and why it has been raised since 2009, the fight to raise it to $15 an hour, the history of the wage by looking at a Supreme Court case from Washington State in 1937, and finally a look at the general opinions of the public, interest groups, and government parties. First of all, to start off with, I want to briefly go over what the minimum wage is and how and why it hasn't been raised. Starting off, the federal minimum wage is controlled by Congress and the executive department called the Department of Labor. However, the last time the federal minimum wage was increased was in July of 2009. This is when the wage was increased from $5.15 per hour to $7.25 per hour. Since then, about 1 million people have been barely making above the minimum wage and currently live in poverty. If you find the average gas prices in 2026 and you're making the minimum wage only working 4 hours a day, you'll make $29. This means most of the money that you make will be spent on gas and daily food. However, it hasn't risen since due to other issues. Government parties and the general public are in a fight to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and that is the reason why so many people are in the fight to raise the wage up. And then this brings us to why this topic interests me. In this section, I'll be talking about why this topic is interesting to me and what my current position is on this topic. To begin with, this topic is interesting to me because due to inflation or an increase in overall prices, the minimum wage is too low to compensate for that. It has been 16 years since the wage has gone up, as mentioned earlier, in July of 2009. When it increased in 2009, it only went up $2.10 from the $5.15 it was at before, which lasted from 1997 until 2007. The other thing is that makes this topic interesting to me is why some people want the wage increase and while others don't. That is one of the goals of this project to find out. Some questions having this topic are, why hasn't it increased even though there's enough support for it in Congress and in the general public? The next question I have is, does inflation play a role in the government's decision on the federal minimum wage? We know that inflation increases and decreases over time, so is that leading the cause why it hasn't changed yet? Now my position on this topic is I believe it is time for an increase in the wage from its low of $7.25. It is long overdue, and yet we sit and wait for that increase. I believe that the wage should be increased to $12 to $15 per hour, as it will help millions of Americans improve their lives and lift many out of poverty. Also, if the wage is increased to that $12 to $15 per hour, it will encourage many more to buy consumer products as they have more money to spend. To sum up my position on this topic in 12 words, the wage needs to be increased to $12 to $15 to battle inflation. Now it is time to see the connection to the Constitution that the federal minimum wage has. The minimum wage is part of the federal executive department and has a home in one called the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. Also, the wage is part of the Fair Labor Standards Act, or FLSA, which was created in 1938. The next connection to the Constitution is Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce in Article 1, Section 8, which justifies the process of raising the minimum wage. The final connection that the wage has to the U.S. Constitution is the issue it has created with the 14th Amendment, which is the due process and freedom of contract. This next section shows how the wage is part of an all-federal level issue. It all begins with how the wage is increased, and also the name of the wage as well. The minimum wage can be only increased if it is approved by Congress and signed into law by the President of the United States. Also, the wage is part of the federal level due to any state being under the minimum is open to consequences from the federal government. Finally, the easiest way to know that the wage is part of the federal government is the name of the wage. And it's simple, the federal minimum wage. The last thing I want to touch up on in this topic is that the local and state governments are allowed to change their minimum wage, but they cannot go below the set wage by the government. If they decide to raise the wage to $10 per hour, all businesses and companies in the state must match the state's minimum wage. Now it's time to talk about the policy towards changing the minimum wage. When any president is in office, the Executive Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division works closely with the president to make sure that everything is meeting the required at or above wage. The head of this agency is also a member of the president's cabinet, and head of the agency also changes every 4 years when we get a new president or any other election. If any business isn't meeting the required wage, they are subject to anything the government can think of, but it has to be fair and not extremely harsh. Now the policy of changing the minimum wage. First of all, the Senate or House Congress workers must write up legislation and present it to the chamber that they are part of. Then the floor will decide if they want to accept or not, and if they do, they refer it to the proper executive department, and in this case, the federal minimum wage will be referred to the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Department, and then it will be referred to the next executive department if it passes that committee, and then it will be referred to the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. If it passes there as well, it will be sent to the House/Senate based on who presented the legislation. If it passes the first chamber of Congress, it will be moved to the next chamber, and if it passes there as well, it will be then head to the President's desk to be signed into law. Now let's go into the actions of going into changing the federal minimum wage. In 2025, Senator Sanders and Bernard introduced an act called Raise the Wage Act, and as of 2026, it is still in the process of being filed/read by the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. If it passes the committee, both chambers of Congress, and is signed into law by the President, the act will immediately raise the wage to $9.50 per hour. And after 1 year of being in law, it will be raised to $11, and then the year after that will be $12.50. Then after 3 years, it will be raised to $14. After 4 years, it will be $15.50. And then after 5 years, it will be at $17. Once the 6-year mark has passed, the Secretary of Federal Wages will increase the wage if the labor statistics show it is time to raise the minimum wage. However, the act still sits in the introduction phase and hasn't been updated since April 8th, 2025 by the Senate. In that update, they stated that the act was read twice and referred to the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and is still sitting there. Everyone hopes that an update will be released soon, that the committee has passed the act and is ready for a vote in the Senate, and then to the House if passed by the Senate. They hope to have this act on the President's desk hopefully by the end of the decade, if not sooner. Now let's talk about the benefits and costs of changing the minimum wage. Talk about the benefits of changing the minimum wage. If it is increased to $15 per hour, it would affect millions of people, bringing hundreds of thousands out of poverty. The living condition of those who need money the most will be able to achieve that goal. Consumer spending will also increase as more people make more money due to higher wages. And finally, increase in the minimum wage will also help combat inflation as inflation continues to increase within time. Now, the cost of increasing the wage to $15. Prices may increase as mentioned before, as more people are making more money. Companies would then need to higher product prices in order to make a profit due to paying employees higher wages. And with increase in prices, inflation will follow and may become permanent. This will lead to many companies investing into AI to prevent paying workers higher wages. Then people will lose their jobs and go into poverty again, which was the reason why the wage was increased to begin with. Finally, this will have businesses find to stay alive and avoiding bankruptcy due to paying higher wages or going all in on artificial intelligence. Now it's time to look at a Supreme Court case regarding the federal minimum wage. This case was called the West Coast Hotel Company v. Parrish. This case was held and heard in the U.S. Supreme Court of Washington State on December 16th, 1936. The argument of this case was that an employee of the West Coast Hotel Company didn't receive an above the minimum wage set by the Industrial Welfare Committee, or IWC. The IWC stated that the minimum wage is $14.50 for each work week of 48 hours. but Parrish did not receive that wage. So Parrish brought it to court to recover the losses of her missing wages, and then it was brought to the state Supreme Court. During arguments, the West Coast Hotel Company argued that the state of Washington's minimum wage law for women was unconstitutional as it violated the 14th Amendment. As stated earlier, the minimum wage was known to cause issues with this amendment as companies claimed that the wage violated this amendment. The 14th Amendment is part of the Due Process Clause or the Freedom of Contract, and companies claim that they can set the wages of workers as low or as high as they choose to. And after 3 months of going through the Supreme Court, the court came to a ruling in a decision of 5-4 favoring Parrish. They stated that the 14th Amendment wasn't being violated and they must pay the loss of wages to Parrish. This then led to the New Deal legislation that fixed the issue with companies claiming the 14th Amendment was being violated. The judge who held the case stated that the court held that establishment of minimum wages was for women was constitutional. Echoing Mueller v. Oregon, 1908, the majority ruled that the state may use its police power to restrict the individual freedom to contract. Now it's time to see the opinions of political parties and interest groups on the issue of the minimum wage. To start off with, the Democrats' party position on the minimum wage is, it is time to raise the wage. Democrats have been saying for years that they wanted to raise the federal minimum wage, so as the 2025 they have an act written up to raise the wage to $15 an hour with a fair tipped wage. This act is called the Raise the Wage Act, and Democrats believe that a house of four should not be in poverty, although the parents are working full-time jobs. This puts the Democratic Party in a place where they're called the People's Party. And now moving on to an interest group that supports raising wage. This group is called the AFL-CIO, America's Union. They believe that the wage should be increased to $15 an hour, and by doing so, 27.3 million workers will be happier, and out of that 27.3 million workers, 1.3 million families will be brought out of poverty. Information provided by the AFL-CIO Americans Union was documented and fact-checked by the Congressional Budget Office. So this interest group believes in raising wages as it will increase consumer spending and work productivity will increase substantially. Now let's look at the opposing views of raising the wage. To start off with, I want to talk about the other political party that has its own viewpoints on raising the wage, and this is the Republican Party. Their position on raising the minimum wage is not the top concern at this time. They believe there are more concerns in the U.S. that they have to worry about. They believe if the wage is increased, prices will rise as more people make more money, and this will lead companies to rely on non-human workers, also known as AI. This will let companies complete their daily work without having to pay workers higher wages. The Republicans believe that companies will raise the prices on their goods in order to combat the increase in worker wages in order to make a profit and prevent bankruptcy. Some Republican members fear that this will result in millions of Americans losing their jobs and more people going into poverty. Now, let's talk about a interest group that believes not in raising the minimum wage. This is the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. This interest group believes that the wage shouldn't be increased, as they state 1.7 million jobs will be lost as companies will go bankrupt and or leave the U.S. for other countries. They also believe that companies will fight to stay alive and see who can make the most money and who can save the most money by investing in AI or other workers that will work for a lot less money. To summarize this interest group in one sentence, the wage shouldn't be increased and should only be increased by a very small amount, or the wage should not be increased at all. And with that being said, that was my political project on the federal minimum wage.